Perfect. Okay, so as people come in, I'm just going to get going because I always have lots of information to present. I'd like to try to have as many resources available for teachers as possible so that you have lots to incorporate into your curriculum that you're designing. So this one is new curriculum and incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into the K-3 ELA and literature program. So we are funded by Learn Alberta and under the Alberta Regional Professional Development Consortium. I am under ELC for Edmonton Regional Learning Consortium, but we're all together now, all 7 groups, and it's a really great way for us to be able to collaborate and bring even more resources to you. And so I'm going to show you some of the resources that are available for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit as well on the ARPDC website in case you haven't seen that yet. Land acknowledgement first. So Tanse, I live on Treaty 7 land here in Calgary, which is the ancestral home of the Blackfoot people. There are also Dene and Métis Nation number 3, which I belong to, as well as the Manitoba Métis Federation. All contributed to the shaping of Alberta and Canada, and I thank them for allowing me to live on this land that is theirs. And if you know your treaty land that you live on, or if there's a settlement close to you, or the land of the people who lived there before it was taken from them, you can always pop that in the chat if you'd like to share. So if you haven't been to any of my presentations before, and I'm actually going to check the participants. Okay, I recognize a couple of names. That's hard because sometimes there's 50 or more people that attend, so I don't always know. But my name is Tammy Johnson, and we're now called Designers of Professional Learning, which I think is a really neat title because we do more than, I put all this information together, obviously, and research it and put it together for teachers, but there's also designing curriculum and collaborating, like I said, all that stuff. And so it really kind of encompasses everything that we do. I'm Red River Métis, which is we're historically from what is known as the Red River Settlement in Manitoba. And those are Métis. We know we identify each other by our last names, is how we know our ties. And we all have European last names because it was our white European great for me, great grandfathers that came to Canada to work for the Hudson Bay Company and took Indigenous wives. And we're all the product of those people. My mom's a Moet, and that's oh, nice. Thanks, Lorna. Moet, McDonald, Mackay, and Beaudry. So you'll notice that the main names of my family are indeed Scottish, so Scottish Métis, but Beaudry's, they are actually an Alberta Voyageur Métis family. And Mackay are also here as well, especially in northern Alberta. So I'm related to all those people. And that's a picture of my great grandfather, James Moet. And there's a school in Fort Saskatchewan, James Moet Elementary, and Moet Park right beside, which is named after him. There's a street in Edmonton named after him, but it's spelled with 2 T's, James Moet Trail. And then that picture beside him is a picture of my grandpa's the middle boy there, Rosser. My uncles Oliver and Stanley, and great aunt Tessie, his surviving children. So I do this work to help teachers to be able to understand how to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into the curriculum. I did a project with an Indigenous education group in northern, well, they call it Northern Alberta, but I know it's kind of midway actually, but Kataskanau Tribal Council and an online school at Ignite to take the grade 7 to 9 outreach program and to indigenize it for their particular cultures on that land and to decolonize it. I did land-based learning and the Cree language, and that was not all on my own. I had help with the specialists. I would confer with them and ask them questions about certain things and learned a lot. And then they had their elders go through it and add more teachings, of course, their own privately that they don't share with other people. And they're very happy with the work I did. And I was encouraged to continue to do this, particularly for non-Indigenous teachers, which they do have a lot on reserved land, is a lot of teachers who are from other places, especially the East Coast. Like one of the principals I worked with was from Newfoundland. So and helping those teachers and understanding, although they do have those people in the community to guide them as well, which is great. But a lot of you don't have that necessarily. So I like to be able to show teachers what you can and cannot do, because I know that's also a concern. I know that teachers are very concerned about being respectful and, not appropriating information. And it's also, what resource do I use? When I first started doing work in this area, 15, 20 years ago, looking at curriculums. I was at college level and looking for stuff for my students in a childcare program, and I could barely find anything. I had to create most of my own stuff, and the only books I could order were from this tiny little bookstore in Winnipeg that didn't have tons of stuff. And now it's exploded, right? So then now it's almost the opposite problem for teachers: is what do we use? How do we narrow this down? How do we know this is okay to use? So I try to answer a lot of those questions. So if there's stuff that comes up and you think of while I'm presenting, um like I said, just make a note of it. You can ask me at the end, and or if you have any resources too that I haven't shown and some great ideas, please also share those at the end. So I promised I'm going to show you the ARPDC website resources, especially for First Nations, Métis, Inuit. I'll show you how to access those. So there's a couple of ways. Well, I should say there's three different ways. So trending resources, if you look down the side, Empowering the Spirit is always a great one to go to. I'll show you that briefly. I use it a lot in my presentations because there's some really great resources here. But you'll notice they've got foundational knowledge, leading the learning, classroom supports, Orange Shirt Day and beyond, and then they have some Français as well. So yeah, so this is here as well. So it gives you some backgrounds in pedagogy and things like that. And as you can see along the bottom, resources probably developed by, and it goes through all the different consortiums, right? So everybody has collaborated to do this work. So these are teachers in your province that either are still in a classroom or like myself, have gone self-employed, or retired teachers that are working on this. Another way that you can find this is to go to find resources by focus. And when you do this, you can see you can click on First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and it's going to come up with the same stuff I just showed you because it was already focused on that for me from the link that I have. Another way is to go by the TQS, which I did a presentation on that last week, and you can search for that there, or information in Français, and then featured websites. So yeah, there's lots of really good information there for teachers to use. All right, so let's get right into it. The crux of all this stuff. So before I start to go through curriculum with teachers and show you different things you could do, I like to make sure that I preface it with a few different things so that you understand exactly, how you should be going about this and the best way to go about it. So the first thing I always talk about is the difference between Indigenous ways of knowing and Western ways of knowing. And there is a document, I kind of borrowed from it yesterday in the presentation I did, but today I just left it. Yeah, so it's a 7-pager, not just a 1-pager, but it does go through and explaining Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge, right? The difference, and I will explain that a little bit. I'm not going to get into great detail, but just kind of give you a little bit of background. So Western ways of knowing really is compartmentalizing information, breaking it into subjects, and being very specific in your studies of those particular subjects. Indigenous ways of knowing is that very circular approach, right? I always say everything we do is in a circle. We meet in a circle. We have medicine wheel, round dance. Like you can go on and on and on, right? Because the sun in the sky looks round, the moon is round. You honor all these things that, like trees grow pretty much in a round shape. Like there's just so many things in nature that are this. And then when we're in a circle together, no one is above anyone else. No one is below anyone else. We're all equal and we're all treated with the same respect, regardless of age or status. So it's just really important to remember that you think of the medicine wheel, if you know anything about it, where you've got your sacred number 4, all things are working together in balance. And so it's that about that balance. And when you talk about balance, you can't separate subjects into pieces, right? So that's really important for you to understand that. And the other thing is, because I'm doing this, I know as a subject, right? Because that's just the way our curriculum is written, ELA. You can't, and it's really important to understand, you can't take an Indigenous way of knowing and just pop it into the curriculum. You have to really design it around that particular information. And if I can explain that any better at this point, but it's not about taking Indigenous knowledge and plopping it in so much as seeing how you can use those teachings, that information, and really build around it, because those are teachings, and stories and things like that are thousands of years old, and they're not meant to be compartmentalized, if that makes sense. So there's risks of integrating knowledge, right? It's really important to know. And there's the three across the screen there, right? So weakening Indigenous traditions by generalizing and taking them out of context. And that's really why I say not to just plop it into the curriculum that way, right? Be very specific and focused on how you're doing that. The other part is denying cultural differences in order to find commonality. I know when I was a kid, many moons ago, we were taught in school, anything Indigenous, everybody was basically the same, right? So if you learned about one Indigenous group, you learned about all of them. So it was always, and back then it was Indians, right? And we mostly learned about American Indians because that was the only thing that was available in information. And so, that's the difference. I mean, even within, I've said this before, my grandpa's family was Métis, mostly Cree, some Ojibwe. The Cree Nation is the largest in Canada, but it spans from parts of Quebec into BC. And so, even within the same area, like when I worked with Kataskanau, there were 5 different groups together, cultural groups together. 2 of them were vastly different than the other 3. They were very religious, very Catholic. And so I had to be very careful about what I designed in terms of the curriculum, and using Indigenous things, like, for instance, not using a dream catcher, or if I had that in their lesson, I had to have alternatives that they could use, because they're not going to want to do that. And that was fine. I just needed to know that. But I mean, that's one difference. There's other differences, even in ceremony practices, et cetera, across, not to mention languages, because there's 5 different dialects of Cree. Within that, there's differences as well, just like any other language, right? And assimilating Indigenous knowledge in a way that it becomes invisible. And that's really what I was talking about as well. So we don't want it to become kind of that platitude where here's, oh, I plopped this in as something Indigenous, so I'm good. Not saying you guys would do that, but I've seen people do that. But it's really lost, right? There's no context. Like, you have to explain which group of people does this and why do they do it, et cetera, right? So yeah, so that, anyways, that document's in there if you want to look and get just a little bit more detail. But I do know, like I said, this is a daunting task for a lot of educators. So hopefully I can help to kind of ease that pain just a little bit. So this is Dr. Joanne Archibald, and I wanted to start with Indigenous storytelling, because storytelling is really integral to Indigenous people in general, right? There's no written language if you think about Indigenous peoples around the world. Even before, think about the English language, and Chaucer, was the first one that we know of, to really write that language down, and how it's evolved from being written then. And that language had existed for, right, how long? And so the Indigenous language is the same thing. Everything is still oral tradition. Many things are starting to be written down, but I also like to preface that with the fact that there's so much lost when you're translating it into English. If those stories are written down and told in their original language, that's another story, because, and I'm kind of a pun there, but not really, because you're going to lose something. There's a beauty to the language. Like, I'm learning Cree, and there is just, I don't know how to explain it. This profound beauty in the language is so linked to the land, and it's so linked to spirit. And so that spiritual content and the land just make it this amazingly poetic type language. And I know people wouldn't have thought of that. And when I was a kid, like I've said in my Cree class, I learned that all things Indigenous were bad. We were taught to hide our cultures, and to not talk about it, not to learn the language. My grandpa spoke Cree, and he wouldn't teach me or any of us, because he didn't want us to get hurt or anything to happen to us, because that's how he grew up. And so these fears were there. But like I said, the language is amazing, but you lose something when you translate to English. That's my only caveat I want to explain to you guys. And you tell stories, yeah, unfortunately, it's just not quite the same. The language is funny. The language is beautiful. We often laugh in Cree class when we, like, how do you explain something, especially something that's new, right? Like a TV or a computer, and the way that you put the words together, because those things never existed, and technology like that never existed. So how do you do that? Like, a cell phone would be literally translate to an interesting object that holds a lot of information, right? Like, but it's also the same word for computer, because it's the same thing, right? So it depends how you say it too, right? So it's also in the inflection. So it's very interesting. But with that said, there's just a little bit of this. I'm not gonna show the entire thing because this is like a 40-minute talk. But if you ever want to learn more about, kind of that Indigenous language arts piece, Joanne Archibald is amazing to get that information from. We'll just watch a little bit of what she has to say about it.
Kwam Huyam Tisquith. Good day. My name is Kwam Huyam, which means strong, clear water. I'm also known as Joanne Archibald, and I'm from Stalo Nation, and I also have Statloom ancestry in British Columbia. Indigenous story work is a term that I developed during my PhD research, and it's a term that part of it comes from Coast Salish ways, where in a cultural gathering, we have a spokesperson who will often say something like, "My dear ones, the work is about to begin." So when we're in a cultural gathering, when we hear those words, then, we stop our talking and moving about, and we know that it's time to pay serious attention to the cultural work that brought us all together. And so with the idea of Indigenous story work, then, it's similar in the way that with Indigenous stories, and these could be traditional stories and life experience stories, that when we might see and hear the term story work, then it's time to become serious or pay serious attention to the work of stories, or to find ways to work with, make meaning from and with Indigenous stories. So, that's the meaning of the term Indigenous story work. Well, I'd say the aim of Indigenous story work is, it's multidimensional, really, that our Indigenous stories really, I think, help us to be the best person that we can be or become, in the way of, finding ways that we're, good to ourselves to become a whole, healthy human being, and also ways that we develop our values, our beliefs, about our relationships with others in our family and in our communities, and also how we have good relationships with our environment and the resources of the environment. So our Indigenous stories can help us do that. Maybe I want to return to the idea of the aim of Indigenous story work, and in this discussion, I want to highlight the 7 principles of Indigenous story work that include respect, responsibility, reverence, reciprocity, and holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. And I'll highlight, just some brief aspects of each of these principles, but I'll mention that they are included in this particular book, Indigenous Story Work, Educating the Heart, Mind, Body, and Spirit, published in 2008 by UBC Press. So if anyone is really interested in knowing a lot more, I'd suggest that you read the book, and it will give you, a much deeper, maybe, understanding of these 7 principles.
So I am going to stop there because I don't have time to show you this. I wish I did, but you will get a copy of a set of the slides and the links that are in it, as well as the recording, hopefully within 5 business days. So I'm going to skip through this. And then you can, if you want to, watch the entire video. She said, she goes through all these 7 principles, and it helps a lot. I think the other thing to understand too is that the structure of Indigenous storytelling is very different than that of Western storytelling. So I think it also offers you an opportunity to take that format and show kids how there are different ways of telling stories, just like we would if we were telling any other cultural stories from around the world. Very much the other part of it is being open-ended. You know, that our stories are open-ended, intending to have the listener, especially if they're children or even if they're older people, to think for themselves and to make good decisions. And so it would keep that in contrast to something perhaps like Aesop's fables, which I remember as a child hearing a lot of. I know we're not using as much in school, but when I was a kid, that was a big one. But at the end, there's always a moral of the story, and what does it teach you? And there was a very closed-ended idea of what you were supposed to get from that. Whereas Indigenous stories would be the opposite of that. At the end, here's what's happened. What do you think you should do? What do you think should happen next? And so very different that way. So again, like, what do you include? What do you not include in terms of in Indigenous curriculum? You know, avoid obviously cultural appropriation. I am going to do an entirely different session just on that, because I've had many questions about it. And if you have specific questions, you can ask me at the end. It's not always cut and dry, that's for sure. Making sure that you're using authorized materials, right? If you've heard a story or you see one on the internet and you're not sure if it should be used, you know, always, you know, contact that person, ask them. If you've heard stories, particularly outside, say, I don't know, in a powwow you've gone to, or a round dance, or some kind of ceremony when an elder or knowledge keeper is presenting, they tell you a story, or you are allowed to hear one. It's always a good idea to ask permission, because there are stories that are only for ceremony, there's stories that are only for family, there's stories that are only for a particular group of people within that culture. And so it's always a good idea to check if you're allowed to share that information. I'll give you an example. For an example, there's songs, which songs are also stories, and so are dances. So everything's storytelling. So when I've gone, like for instance, a pipe ceremony that we have at the beginning of our Cree class, the first class is a pipe ceremony and a feast. And so we're taught songs that we can sing. And one of them is, for instance, called the Buffalo Song. And one of the ladies there that I know I drum with as well on Thursday nights, she was there and she sang it. And then she said, oh, I don't know if I'm in trouble. She said, because I sang this at she goes to grandmother's circle, and she sang it. And our elders said, you're okay as long as you're singing this in ceremony. It's a ceremony song, but you're not to record it. You're not to put it on, like, say, social media or YouTube or whatever, because ceremony songs you're not allowed to do that, right? They're only for in ceremony, and that's the difference. So that's the kind of idea that I'm talking about. It's always a good idea to ask first before you do that. The other thing is obviously to engage in ceremony without an elder. You know, things like smudging and that. And you know, there's different opinions on this. I'll just tell you my personal opinion. My personal opinion is smudge your classroom, smudge yourself if you want, but I'd leave the kids alone. That's just my personal opinion. But I do know of teachers that allow, like, they let the families know that they're doing this in their classroom either every day or in the morning of the first day of the week or whatever, and they smudge and then they leave it. They don't smudge the children, but if the children want to go up and do it, they're allowed to. Now, again, like I said, that is something only if the parents are informed, as far as I'm concerned, because that's a spiritual practice, and I don't think that we should be imposing that on anybody else's children. So that's just my personal opinion. Things to include for sure: storytelling, like I said, for authorized and published stories for sure. Land-based learning, we're moving slowly to cultural-based learning as the term for that. Language, so vocabulary and phrases that you can find in the language of the people that are closest to you or that lived on that land, and then ways of knowing and being. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is a very short video. I don't like to show just a whole series of videos, but this is a really short one, just really, I think, explains in best why Indigenous ways of knowing are important in language arts.
Why don't we write down our history? We have always had a lot of people who were speakers and leaders that told stories and gave us our history through the spoken word. We hear stories over and over again to help us to understand why things come to be or why things happen the way they are now. So all of our why don't we write down our history?
I just touched a button and I did that.
Stories and gave us our history through the spoken word. We hear stories over and over again to help us to understand why things come to be or why things happen the way they are now. So all of our history it's very, very important to be listening to our elders so that the stories they tell us, we can hold on to and then pass on to our children.
Is there any other way that we could have recorded our history?
Yes, we have other ways of recording our history. Once we encountered the Europeans, we had to start recording our history using the wampum belts, because we started having agreements, making agreements with them. And, the only way that we were able to remember both sides, they were writing it down and we were recording it in our wampum belts. And it was also spoken in our language so that we would remember it. So we still have the oral version of the story of the wampum as well as the wampum itself, so that you can see it written in the belts.
And of course, that's an Ontario, Eastern Canada one, because that's not Plains Indigenous peoples. So some ideas for you to know how to honor Indigenous storytelling when you're doing this and to present it in a good way. And I mentioned using authentic texts, right? So identifying authentic text can be a challenge, right? I was talking about that too. So to assist with that, there is a guide, and I have a link here as well, that FNESC has published as a resource guide. And it's the Authentic First Peoples resource for use in K-7 classrooms. And that's online. And so hopefully that'll help you a little bit. I did have a question during that video that's underway. I ended up clicking on that. Sorry, I apologize about that. But the reason that there's no cut and dried, and I always have to explain this every time I do presentations about anything, like there's protocols for everything that we do, okay? But those protocols may be different and probably are in different places. And my best explanation is, and I gave this example yesterday, so keep it consistent. I go to sweat lodges and I've gone to 2 different places. And each place, the protocols are slightly different. And what I mean by that is, like one place is very strict about like, you can't wear any jewel, like wait, sweat lodge is supposed to be as a rebirth, right? So you go into the womb of Mother Earth and you come out reborn, and so you're not supposed to be wearing any jewelry, that sort of thing. But some places aren't as strict about that, and or women are supposed to cover up their shoulders, and so I always make sure I cover up my shoulders whenever I'm wearing these, even because it gets really hot in there, and not wear anything that's too, revealing, obviously, and be modest. And women wear skirts and we sit to the side, or we sit with our legs out in front of us. You're not allowed to cross them. Like there's different things, right? Those are pretty standard. But then there's some other things where the ceremony may not be gone through exactly the same every place. And so wherever you go, even within the same city and within same groups of people, somebody may have different teachings. So that's why I say you have to ask that. It's not something that we can write down and say, well, this is a rule for everybody. There are protocols we can say, well, these are pretty consistent and generally what you might expect, so that you have an idea, like with sharing circles or going to a ceremony. But you have to really watch and follow along. I do too when I go to a new place, because I don't know those people, and I watch to see what they're going to do and how they're going to handle it. So that's my best explanation for that. And remembering the different stories have different purposes, right? So the traditional and contemporary First Peoples stories are told for teaching, as she was saying, right? So there's life lessons, community responsibility, rites of passage, creation stories, recording personal history, like on and on, right? So anything you could think of that was written in a book for Western people is a story that's passed down through generations. So some of these stories are thousands of years old, because we know that Indigenous people, last finding that I saw through National Geographic was 15,000 years ago. So that's archaeological. And as far as archaeologists know, right, because they also don't know everything, and they also don't know everything about dating things, because they've been wrong about many things, and that's fine. That's part of learning, right? But Indigenous people, the First Nations people, believe they have always been here. So, just keep in mind that these stories and these teachings have been around, some of them for thousands of years. So it's not knowledge that should just be taken lightly, for instance, for sure, right? I'd say for myself, for Métis stories, definitely more the Western bent of it, right? And told usually with, jigging and fiddling and eating and all those things, that took place in the darker, colder times of the year, and not quite the same reverence, right, as First Nations and Inuit people in general. Copyright and protocol, right? So I did mention this, right? So it's important to recognize the local cultural protocols that exist, as I said. So asking that permission, looking to them, talking to the different people. And honestly, most of the time, unless it's a ceremony thing or family that's a thing that you've heard, generally they're going to say yes. It's just you need to ask. And that's part of our thing too, is we don't do it and then ask for permission later. It's extremely disrespectful. So it's completely the opposite of Western ways of doing it. Whereas, if I'm working someplace and I'm like, I know the culture is Western, and I'm just like, well, you go ahead and do it and you ask for permission or forgiveness later, right? And then because it's already done. But if you do that with Indigenous cultures, it's very rude and disrespectful, especially toward the older people that are there. So the other thing is really important to remember that story, legend, and myth, because the connotations often associated with the terms legend and myth as meaning fiction. It's preferable to use the term story and traditional story, as far as I'm concerned too. And I took this from a document. And I learned this tutoring. I was tutoring a young man in high school, and his family is Chinese, and so he's ESL, and so I was trying to help him, or I know that's not the right term anymore, ELA. And I think they've changed it again, and I can't keep up. But I was helping him, and there was a document that his teacher had printed off. And you know what? I get teachers, you're busy, you take stuff off the internet. And it was, first of all, Native American, which is fine because that's a different, but giving that to the kids here in Canada, not saying First Nations or First Peoples, but it lived on their animal myths. And I just went, I was so angry. I was very angry. I don't know. I can't explain the feeling that I had when I read that. It was like, are you kidding me? Because what is a myth and a legend to somebody else is part of your culture and story and truth. So animism is accepted and as real, but just because you don't believe it doesn't make it a legend or a myth. So I think it's just really important with language. I don't think you have to tell children that this is the truth, right? Because that's our truth. And that's also Indigenous, like your truth, my truth, et cetera. Like everybody's in a different place. But I also think that it's really important to honor those stories by saying that story or traditional story. It's my one personal bugaboo I'm going to share. But there's so many different themes and topics that you can encounter, and there's a whole list of them here of things that you can come up with, and it covers everything, right? And then lastly, really important, like I said, if you've encountered an unfamiliar Aboriginal or Indigenous word, and you're afraid to be disrespectful if you mispronounce it, what should you do, right? So you could ask somebody in your local area, or I put a link here for there's learning resources for languages, but there's also apps. Like I use, as I'm learning Plains Cree, I use a Masquerade app that's available on the Apple Store, and there's also Cree Dictionary. So the I think it's Itawana. I can't remember the name of it. Anyways, but there's that. So it's also an app for that too. And some of it is recorded. Some different Indigenous speakers go on there and use that. So you can always use the app too, right? Like if you're not sure about how to say the word, just use the app to pronounce it. What's really nice for the young ones is a lot of that stuff is on YouTube, and you've got Indigenous speakers that have pronounced the words for some of the stories, so that if you wanted to show the video instead, that's an option too. Great storytelling, and I'm not going to show you the videos, but there is a channel with a whole list of videos for the young ones with Elder Hazel, and she works at the University of Regina and at the museum there. She's amazing. I love this lady. I think she's a great example of Indigenous storytellers, and I just want to show you that she has, that's that lady right there. There she is, Elder Hazel. And so she has all kinds of stories on here, right? So she's got basically, how different animals got their, the same idea, like if you think of fables, right? But it's told as an Indigenous story. And then she goes through the 7 grandfather stories as well. And so but if you wanted to watch some of these, like she's just so amazing. She's so gentle. You can see the one she made when she was younger, or she was still dyeing her hair and then she went white. Maybe doing all this work made her go white. I'm not sure. But yeah, there's just some great stories on there. And I think getting kids to be expressive, and they're just really engaging when elders tell stories, right? They'll walk, you're in a circle and they'll walk up to somebody if they're doing like a bear, and they're like, "Rah," and they'll come at you. And, like, especially if the kids are kind of dozing off because they're getting tired, and they'll do that. And everyone goes, "Ah," and then, but, or they'll get down, depending on their age, on the ground and act out the animal, that sort of thing. So I did want to give you an example of a lesson plan here. So this is, the story of the giving tree. So, and I did put a link there to the Learn Alberta, to the physical education and wellness too, because there's, some tie-ins is there, in terms of the wellness is always part of, like, the spiritual development is always part of our stories. I included this one too because it's Métis and I'm Métis, and I thought that it would be nice to include that. And this is by Leah Dorian, and I love her stuff. She's an amazing artist and storyteller. Now I will play just a little bit of this, so just so you have an idea for the lesson plan, but it is available on this video in both English and in Michif. I don't speak Michif. I have basic French from Manitoba, and I'm hoping once I've got the Cree down too that I'll be able to.
The Giving Tree, a retelling of a traditional Métis story about giving and receiving. Written and illustrated by Leah Dorian, Michif translation by Norman Fleury. A long time ago, there was once a tree. It was an old, twisted Manitoba maple. This Manitoba maple was special. She had a large, weathered hollow within her trunk. Maybe this hollow was once home to a family of birds, or it might have been the sleeping place for a traveling porcupine. One thing for certain, this tree was beloved by my grandpa. Grandpa often called her the Giving Tree. So I asked my grandpa to tell me a story from his childhood memories. He said, long ago, when I was a little boy, my mama and papa often traveled by horse and wagon to visit our relations. My favorite part of our trip was the pipe break at the Giving Tree. This tree was located at the halfway point between our related Métis villages. It was the Métis way to stop for tea and bannock at the Giving Tree. As small kids, we got very excited at the sight of the tree as she appeared around the bend in the trail. It was our tradition to sprinkle an offering of tobacco at the base of her trunk every time we visited the tree. It was fun to unload our wagon for a friendly family picnic under her protective canopy. We loved to make a small fire, to boil our tea, cook our bannock, gather around to tell stories, and to chew on our dry meat. The most magical memory that I have was the time when my mama forgot to pack our sugar into the grub box. Oh my goodness gracious, said Mama, I forgot to pack sugar for our tea and bannock. Son, spoke Papa, come here. I want you to help me with something. So Papa lifted me up to look into the big hollow within the maple tree. To my surprise, in the bottom of the hollow, there was sugar, tea, bundles of tobacco, letters, flour, and even a pair of moccasins. There was so much stuff hidden deep inside her hollow. I was awestruck as I pulled out a little canister of sugar. As Papa lowered me down, I said, Papa, what's all that stuff doing in there? My Papa explained to me that this Giving Tree is a sacred place for us Métis people. He told me that for generations, the tree hollow was used by Métis travelers as a cache, so that it could help our people out in times of need. My Papa said that it was the Métis way to use the tree cache as a message center and as an emergency supply stash. For generations, the tree cache was a symbol of honesty and respect. Papa told me that once a young man left an engagement ring for his sweetheart inside the tree. 2 days later, the ring was delivered to his sweetheart safely by a man passing by her home. Papa loved our old Métis ways. Papa spoke of our beliefs. If you take something from the tree cache, you are responsible to put something back in return. Papa reminded me that it is our Métis way to be kind, generous, and helpful to others. Mama came over to the tree to get the sugar canister. She put several folded polka-dotted hankies and a small pail into my hand so I could offer them back into the hollow. Mama thought that somebody might find the hankies useful, especially if they had a runny nose or needed a rag. It was so fun to place our offering back into the maple tree. I wondered who would someday get those polka-dotted hankies.
Okay, there's a bit more of the story, but I'm
That
gonna,
day,
sorry.
I understood why the old timers called her
stop.
the giving tree.
Sorry.
And she's
It's getting shut down. Because it keeps wanting to go. Sorry. Sorry, it's looking at one more message. Oh. That's that. Sorry. So that is the story of the giving tree. And like I said, I wanted to include a Métis story because I know there's so many First Nations stories that are amazing and Inuit stories as well. But not a lot of people, as far as I know, have a lot of experience with Métis stories, especially for children. So I thought I would just show you that and also show you there's a lesson plan that has been developed by the Workland School of Education. And I love when their students, like their graduate students, create lessons. So this is done by one of their students that's online. And she goes through the actual story and explains the rationale for studying it, looking at Western knowledge. This is the part I really love, the Western knowledge and traditional knowledge. And then, you know, gives a completely laid out, you know, lesson plan that you could either use it if it's appropriate for your classroom or, you know, modify it obviously as we do as teachers. But really nice too. I mean, I know the outcomes have changed now, but obviously you could easily match those up. And then of course she goes through the courses that are there, but there's also some visuals, right? Some things that you could also use to print off and use. And then, yeah, it's just I like this anyways. And then she's got some examples as well too, things that you could use. I can't answer that one. So what would be the proper steps to be request use of this story from this website? This story, in terms of, I'm going to be honest, in terms of Métis stories, you can probably go ahead and use them. I'm going to be honest, because we don't have the same protocols as First Nations and Inuit people. So, or Inuit, and it's redundant to say Inuit people, sorry. We don't. So you're pretty safe to use Métis stories in general. Another reason I include that is a little bit easier. So I did want to include some links for you, and I hopefully have enough time to go through most of these just to touch on them so you can see. But I did want to show you Strong Nations and Good Minds are my two favorite ones to order books from in particular. I think I have Good Minds in here as well, but Good Minds is awesome because the way it's organized and the way that you can look for curriculum on there, it's amazing. But as you can see, like they have so many different books on here, and you can go buy Alberta literature to support First Nations Métis Inuit success, and it's an old link, but you know they've got updated resources all the time. You can go on sale, obviously. You can go, you know, and what's I'm gonna look here. If I go to books, kids, teens, adults, and then there's education resources as well. So you can choose a main category and go to it. And they've also got them in French as well. So those are really nice. And obviously the Métis ones, they have a lot of them in Michif as well. Also, I recommend, I've got a link here for Gabriel Dumont Institute as well. And Rupert's Land also has resources that you can buy too, just not as vast. I did include a couple of book lists here. So I wanted to include, and I'll show you the other one has a visual with a book on it as well. But these ones go through a number of books and give you a breakdown of them. And so often it can be difficult to decide what books you want to use, but I want to include this because it has, you know, like I said, it's a pretty good list of of books that you can use, and it tells you kind of by category. And then they go into different areas of Dene books, you know, and Métis books, and et cetera, right? So they go through that. Anyways, I wanted to show you that. So I've included that link. And then the next one is that one with the, it's one with the visuals. Yes, there we go. So just Nokum is my teacher. So my there you go. So again, they have great breakdown of what the story is. It tells you the grade level, gives you a really nice synopsis, and gives you obviously a picture of the book so you have an idea. And then you can obviously look up these on, like I said, on Good Minds or Strong Minds. Sorry, Strong Nations, Good Minds. Now I'm mixing up the names of things. And I did want to include, obviously, for you, this is the one that's for Gabriel Dumont Institute, but if you wanted to look, they actually have, if you've got a high population of Métis students in your class, you might want to look at this. It's bringing Métis children's literature to life. And you'll see that the Giving Tree is on there, as a matter of fact, but a lot of Leah Dorian books in there are in there as well, so you can look at those. All right, so this is UBC, I think. Oh, this is U of A, sorry, I've got a UBC one in here as well. So U of A has some really great stuff that they've done too. And this is K-12 infusing Indigenous texts in the classroom. So this is, and again, they have an annotated book list themselves through AIR, and it's from AIR-PDC through us. So they've got that link. But then they've also got them listed by different Indigenous groups too, right? So they've got that. They also have lesson plans on the sides that you can link to, right? So different ones for the Manitoba Teachers Association as well, which, yeah, I mean, I grew up in Manitoba and worked there as a teacher for a few years before I came to Alberta. And it's a big focus, obviously, because the highest population outside of Regina of Indigenous students is in Winnipeg. So there's a lot done that way. Sorry, I'll answer some of those questions at the end. Sorry, I'm looking at those, but I'll kind of address some of that stuff if you don't mind once I'm just done this. Indigenous Literature Kit through Empowering the Spirit, and that is an AIR-PDC resource. I thought I'd show you guys this because there's also a literature kit here for K-12 that has a lot of great information. Like I said, this goes by scope and sequence, which I know is old now, but everybody can align that pretty easily. Some books, it gives you the division and the list of them, so you could, there's a good many books here as well. I know some of them overlap and repeat, but in general, it's just nice to have, I think, myself, if I wasn't sure about any books and what I should be using to give you that. And there is obviously division 1 is right there, and you can go through that, but you guys can read, so I'm not going to go through that in detail. And then this is, I think this is the UBC. Thank you. Yeah. So UBC as well has amazing stuff. They've been developing materials 25, 30 years now for Indigenous peoples. And yes, it does mostly focus on their people, but I think that, whereas teachers are really great at taking an idea at least and modifying that to fit what we would like to do. And, so it might give you some ideas at least. And there are more links there to how to evaluate, children's materials and things like that. And they've got them by subject heading, etc. Right, and like I said, there's a video on this one as well too, I think. And there's also lesson plans and pedagogies and all that stuff. So there's all this stuff down the side that you can look at. Last one. I'm doing okay with time. This is just kind of a pedagogical background for you guys, just so you have it as well. In terms of Indigenous oral histories and primary sources, and kind of give you a little bit of that background and what I was talking about, the oral history and the importance of it, and really looking at, contextualizing this information. And again, too, like, as I said to you, in some cases, like right there, oral stories can only be told at certain times and places. And you can see that's where I actually didn't find the video on this website, but they included as there as well. And then the idea of colonization too, and it's really important in reclaiming oral histories is important to understand too. These stories are, like I said, thousands of years old, some of them. And I had been asked at a presentation I was doing with a private company that I also contract with sometimes. And it was to a Cree Nation from Northern Alberta. I did in Edmonton. when a non-Indigenous teacher asked me this question, well, how important is it to continue teaching these things, you know, like the history and the stories, you know, for us, kind of almost like, and it wasn't done in a malevolent way at all, but my response was I tried to be very measured, because I felt that kind of like feeling inside of me, and I just said, you know, you're taking stories and histories that are thousands of years old, and I don't think that a couple hundred years of being colonized and trying to destroy that should be negated because of that short period of time. It's done a lot of damage, yes, but we can regain these, and we can fix a lot of it. Some of it's definitely lost, but we can fix some of it, right? So I think it's a part of that reconciliation piece as well. Whenever you're doing this work and presenting this to our students and our kids, you're helping with that piece.